Before we start the show, don't forget to check our new ebook, Kill All Bugs, Learn Software Testing in One Day. For a limited time, it's only $9.99. Links in description.
If you've ever set up a new operating system or installed some big piece of software or even just bought a new laptop, you've definitely seen the terms 32-bit or 64-bit pop up.
They're everywhere.
They sound so abstract, but these two little numbers, they pretty much control everything from how much memory your machine can use to, how fast it can actually think. So today, we are doing a deep dive into computer architecture based on the sources you sent over. Our mission is to kind of cut through the jargon and pull out the real differences between 32-bit and 64-bit systems.
Right, the stuff that actually matters.
Exactly. The things that explain why one is basically museum piece now and the other is just the standard.
Yeah.
We're turning those bits and bytes into something practical. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Well, to start, I think we have to define what a bit even means in this context. A good way to think about it is like, imagine the number 32 or 64 as the number of lanes on a highway.
Okay.
That highway connects your CPU, your processor, to everything else, especially memory.
Yeah.
So it defines how much data the CPU can process in one go.
So a 64-lane highway is twice as wide as a 32-lane one. That makes sense.
Exactly. It's about bandwidth.
So what's the super technical definition of these architectures?
Simply put, a 32-bit CPU just means it uses memory addresses and processes data in chunks that are 32 bits wide. It's a very specific and, as we'll see, a very limited pipe. A 64-bit microprocessor, on the other hand, it processes data and memory addresses that are represented by 64 bits.
And that extra width, that affects every single calculation, right?
Every single one.
And it's funny because 64-bit feels so modern, but there's this huge historical disconnect here. The 32-bit processor was the standard for, decades?
Oh, yeah.
In all our home PCs, the Intel Pentiums, the AMDs, all the way up to the early 2000s.
That's right. It completely dominated the PC world through the 90s. But what's really fascinating, and the sources make this clear, is that the 64-bit concept wasn't new at all when we finally got it.
It was around for a while before that.
A long while. We know 64-bit CPUs were running in supercomputers as early as the 1970s.
The 70s.
Yeah. And they showed up in specialized workstations and servers in the early 90s.
So the tech was sitting there on the fringes for decades. But the average person, like you or me, we just didn't see the need for it until things started breaking.
Exactly. What caused that tipping point was really the explosion in memory demands.
Right.
The official landmark moment for consumers was April 2003. That's when AMD released its first AMD 64 processor, the Optron. That was the start of the shift for desktops.
And even in newer stuff like smartphones with ARM architecture, that only went 64-bit in, 2013?
September 2013, yeah. The consumer world it resists change until it hits an absolute architectural wall.
And that wall, without a doubt, was the 4-gigabyte limit.
Which brings us to our first segment, the memory frontier. This is where it gets really interesting.
It really is the aha moment. It's the reason you just can't run a modern system on a 32-bit setup anymore. The addressable space, that's how many unique spots in memory the CPU can talk to. That is the ultimate barrier.
Okay, so break that down. A 32-bit processor is limited 2 to the power of 32 addresses. That translates directly to 4 gigabytes of space. And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
If you had a 32-bit OS and actually installed 4 gigs of RAM,
you couldn't even use it all.
You couldn't use it all. The system reserves some of that address space for hardware, so you're practically capped at around 3.2 gigs.
4 gigabytes. I rember thinking 128 megabytes was an insane amount of memory.
We all do.
Now, 4 gigs is what my web browser uses if I have a few tabs open.
Yeah, exactly. Modern software just completely shattered that ceiling. So now you compare that to a 64-bit processor.
Which is?
It can address 2 to the power of 64 locations. Theoretically, that translates to 16 exabytes of addressable space.
Okay, wait. 16 exabytes? That's 17 billion gigabytes. That's a number that's so big it's meaningless.
It is.
We're never going to hit that in a home computer. So why? Why so big? Was that just massive overkill?
That's a great question, and it's really about future-proofing. While the practical limit for physical RAM today is closer to 16.8 terabytes.
It's still a huge number.
A huge number. But that enormous addressing space allows for a massive virtual memory, 16 terabytes of it split between your programs and the operating system itself. It just prevents us from hitting another hard memory wall in, 5 or 10 years.
Which is exactly what happened with 32-bit.
Precisely. So the move wasn't just to speed things up a little bit, it was to completely eliminate the memory bottleneck for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so now that we've covered memory, let's move into segment 2, performance. Because it's not just about how much stuff you can store, it's how fast you can use it.
Right, this is about efficiency, not just volume.
Yeah.
Because you can handle 64 bits of data at once, the processor is working with a wider instruction set. But more importantly, 64-bit architecture gives you access to a much larger set of registers.
And registers are.
Exactly.
There are like little bits of super fast storage located right inside the CPU itself.
Okay.
A 64-bit processor has more of them, and they're bigger. This means it can hold more data from a calculation right there on the chip, which speeds up really complex operations.
Like video editing or
Yeah.
video editing, running big simulations, even just heavy multitasking. A 32-bit system just overflows those internal buffers way, way faster.
That makes perfect sense. So it's not just that the highway is wider, but the delivery trucks inside the warehouse are bigger, and there are more of them.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And that increased bandwidth is what lets modern processors really take advantage of having, 2 cores, 4 cores, 8 cores. The cores can actually share complex data efficiently.
Which brings us to compatibility, because this is where people get really confused. Let's try to boil this down to the key rules.
Okay, the first rule is about the CPU itself. A 64-bit CPU is flexible. It can run a 32-bit operating system or a 64-bit one.
It can run in the old mode, basically.
Right. But a 32-bit CPU is totally inflexible. It has to run a 32-bit OS. No other option.
And the second rule is about the whole system working together.
Correct. If you want to use a 64-bit OS, you absolutely need a 64-bit CPU. And if you want to run modern 64-bit apps like the newest Adobe software or a big new game, they will only work on a 64-bit OS.
They demand that wider highway we were talking about.
They do. The good news is that most older 32-bit applications will still run just fine on a 64-bit system.
Which makes upgrading a lot smoother for most people.
Yeah, unless you're using some really ancient specific software.
And when you look at the list of supported operating systems, it really tells the story. For 32-bit, you're looking at Windows, XP, Vista, basically ghosts.
Very much so.
But 64-bit supports everything modern, Windows 10 and 11, Mac OS, current Linux. It's just the global standard. So let's pivot to our final segment, the pros and cons. Looking at 32-bit architecture today, is there any advantage left at all?
There's really only one, and it's a niche one. Its only advantage is compatibility with really old legacy hardware.
Like a 25-year-old machine in a factory or something.
Exactly. Something where the company that made the driver software doesn't even exist anymore. If your business depends on that, you might be stuck.
But that's it.
That's pretty much it. And that's really why it became obsolete. Vendors just stopped making apps for 32-bit systems. And you'll almost never find 32-bit drivers for, say, a new printer. The whole ecosystem just moved on.
Right. So on the 64-bit side, beyond the obvious stuff like memory and speed, you mentioned security. And this isn't just a software patch, right? This is built into the architecture.
Exactly. It's a lock built into the silicon. A modern 64-bit CPU paired with a 64-bit version of Windows gives you security features that are just not possible on 32-bit systems.
And what are we talking about specifically?
The big one is something called hardware kernel patch protection. The kernel is the absolute core of your operating system. If malware, like a rootkit, can mess with the kernel, it owns your entire system and you'll never even see it.
Okay, that's bad.
Very bad. This hardware protection basically prevents that deep-level tampering. It makes sure that only authorized, digitally signed code can touch the kernel. It shuts the door on the most dangerous types of malware.
That is a huge benefit. Security that's part of the foundation, not just an app you install.
It is. And, just going back to math for a second, being able to store 2 to the 64th power computational values, it allows for these lightning-fast calculations that are essential for big data, graphics, science, workloads that were just impossible before.
So are there any real drawbacks to 64-bit that people should know about?
They're pretty minor and getting smaller every day. Like we said, if you have a really old scanner or something, you probably won't find a 64-bit driver for it.
Sure.
While most 32-bit software works, some very old, very poorly written apps might get a bit unstable. But really, those are tiny sacrifices for everything you gain.
So this brings us to the big question for any listener with an older machine. Should I upgrade to 64-bit?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. If you want a computer that is supported, secure, and can actually perform modern tasks, you have to make sure your essential software is compatible. But since almost every computer sold in the last decade is 64-bit, and almost all software is too, the path is pretty clear.
Trying to work on a machine that's capped at 3.2 gigs of RAM today is just...
A recipe for frustration. It's just not viable.
So what does this all mean then? When we boil it all down, the difference between 32-bit and 64-bit, it's really about a necessary escape. It was about breaking free from that crippling 4 gigabyte memory bottleneck to a capacity that's, for all intents and purposes, limitless. This shift wasn't for convenience. It was to enable everything we do today through wider data paths, those bigger registers, multi-core processors, and these really essential built-in security features.
Yet, if we connect this all the way back to the history we talked about at the start, it raises a really interesting question for you, the listener.
Go on.
We mentioned that 64-bit architecture was running in supercomputers back in the 1970s, decades before you and I ever saw it. So that makes you wonder, what radical changes, maybe in quantum computing or neuromorphic chips, are running right now on today's most advanced machines?
The things that will fundamentally transform how we use computers.
Right, but that the average person won't actually get their hands on for another 20 or maybe even 30 years.
Hey, yo, haven't you checked out our new book yet? Link in description.